If you are hoping to adopt, you're in for a real treat today, because today we're going to be focused on giving you an intentional way that you can be preparing to become a hopeful adoptive parent that is really connected with your adopted child. If we haven't met yet, my name is Amanda, and I'm an adoption profile expert. I help hopeful adoptive families create and share their adoption profiles so that they can match faster. If you haven't taken a moment to do so, I certainly would love it if you would hit that subscribe button, ring the little bell so that you'll be notified each and every time I release a new video. Today, you're in for a real treat, because today we are having a conversation with Melissa from the Adoption Connection. Melissa is going to be talking with us about brain-based therapies that we can really use to help create a more connected relationship with our child once they actually come home. You see, one of the big questions I often get from our community are, what are some positive ways that I can be spending this time waiting for my child to come home? And I believe that understanding what parenting an adopted child is like is one of those really great ways. And Melissa is an amazing resource. I found Melissa on my own adoptive parenting journey, just trying to understand and unpack certain behaviors and things that I was seeing in my own home. And so I thought she would be a really great resource for you as well. Melissa has some practical protocols and tools that really are based in how the human brain works. As a matter of fact, Melissa has road tested this not only in her own house, but also with hundreds of other adoptive families. Melissa and her husband, Patrick, have 6 children, some through birth as well as some through adoption. So Melissa really understands what works and what doesn't when it comes to adoptive and connected parenting. I am so excited to welcome Melissa to our show today. Melissa, thank you so much for being willing to join us today on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Amanda.
Well, you guys, you're in for a real treat today. I first came across Melissa's work, probably a few months ago when I was struggling in my own adoptive parent journey, in a post-adoption world. And I really thought that this would be a great resource for you all to really dive into in the waiting period. So I'm so excited for Melissa to really kind of join us today and really help us focus our mind and energy into preparing ourselves to really be the best parents we can for these kiddos that we so desperately want to bring into our homes. So to that end, Melissa, would you be willing to share with us a few tips of things that you think that hopeful adoptive parents could be doing and researching and really diving deep into as they prepare for their adoptive parent journey ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was thinking through this and kind of sending you some notes, Amanda, before we chatted, I came up with a couple. Do you want me to just kind of run through them quickly? Do you want to go point by point?
Why don't we go point by point? And that way we can really kind of unpack it for the audience.
Yeah. Okay. And so I'll just prep you and your audience ahead of time. Some of what I'm going to say probably won't be easy to hear. But this comes from, decades as an adopted person, over a decade of being an adoptive parent. And I mean, this is like real life, like brutal honesty. So I'll just say that up front. So the first thing, goes all the way back to the reasons that parents adopt. And so I like to just challenge parents who are kind of in the process to really think about why they're adopting and be really honest about it. And this is a really tricky one because I know that there are so many reasons that families come to make an adoption plan, but I really challenge parents to think about whether their reasons are parent-centered or child-centered. And if they're a little bit more parent-centered, I really encourage families to do a little bit more work, a little bit more grief work, a little bit more self-reflecting before they jump into the process of adoption.
I completely agree. I like that you touched on grief work there, because I think that was something that, quite honestly, I overlooked in my own journey because I was just so focused on reaching that end goal of becoming a mother that I didn't really take the time to unpack the grief that I had from an infertility perspective, honestly, until after we had our disruption, which was our first adoption opportunity. And then it really kind of just overwhelmed me. And I literally had days where I just couldn't get off the couch, and I couldn't understand why, because I've always been a person that could just see the goal and push forward and just keep going until I got to the goal. And that was the first moment that I realized that I had grief and that maybe I wasn't entering into this journey with the most clear perspective that would really help serve the child in the end, which was obviously my ultimate goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. Can you share a few more examples of being more child-centered versus parent-centered as we're kind of entering into this adoption journey?
Yeah. So I think, like your story, Amanda, a lot of parents turn to adoption when they struggle with infertility and they just desperately want to be parents. And there's nothing categorically wrong with that, path or that logic. But it is a little one-sided. And so you mentioned grief. There's so much grief on a parent's part of the journey coming into that, but there's also a ton of grief and loss for the adopted child. And so what I find as I serve adoptive families is that sometimes if there's high expectations on the parent side for adoption being a means to completing their family or becoming parents, that puts an awful lot of pressure and a lot of times, subconscious pressure on a child. And so on the other hand, you have a child coming to a family through either adoption or foster care, and there's loss of culture, there's loss of birth family, and all of that shifts and changes the way that the brain perceives the world, the way it handles stress. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a lot of times that means that children who have come to their families through foster care or adoption kind of have these really big behaviors. And it's not across the board, but it's more often than not. It's often enough that we kind of want parents to think about what that might look like. And so, if all you wanted to do was be a parent and all of the sudden the parenting journey doesn't look quite like you imagined, that's a lot to process. It's already a lot to process, a child with really high needs. And then when you layer that on top of, perhaps unresolved grief or expectations that, this child was maybe going to act like the rest of your friends who have children and what their children look like, or that your family would be able to do all the things that your friends are doing. It's just really complicated. And so obviously it does put a child in a family, but we really like families to think about, can I provide, am I called to this? Can I provide a home to a child, even if the child maybe never even wants to be a part of our family? And those are some really big questions to wrestle with.
They really are. They're really tough. And I'll admit it, at the start of my own journey, I just assumed that trauma or understanding trauma was something that really only came with foster care. And I didn't really understand that could even happen with newborn infant adoption that was, private as well. And so that's why I think that your work is so helpful to hopeful adoptive families out there, is to really understand that from the beginning, because it can, again, give you different clues to things as you go through those initial stages of bringing baby home and then transitioning into toddlerhood and all of these other areas that maybe people in our circle, in our support circle, in our real life don't really understand because they haven't walked in an adoption story or an adoption journey. And so that's why I think it's really important to really get into community with people that are going through that and understand that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think you have another tip for us.
Yeah. So I also encourage families that are on the journey to start following a diverse selection of adoptees, either through reading their books, following them on social media, listening to their podcasts. I think one of the things that I talk about the most when I speak is every adoptee story is different and every adoptee experiences their story differently. And so it's important to hear from even adoptees that aren't from the same story that you're walking, like, former foster youth, adoptees who are adopted at older ages, adoptees who are adopted as infants, transracial adoptees, adoptees that were adopted into the same race or culture or country. I think it's really important to understand how diverse the adoption community can be.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, again, just researching that ahead of time so that even when you're in those initial first stages of choosing what you really feel that you're equipped to parent, having that research up front and then saying, you know what, I feel like I'll be able to handle these types of situations, or I have these resources to turn to make me better equipped for these types of situations is really important. And I think that just makes you a better informed partner along the triad as you kind of go through the journey. Do you have any particular resources that you suggest? Obviously, other than your own, because I think that your resource is amazing, but any other resources that you think that, the community should be considering following?
Yeah, our podcast does have quite a few stories from around the triad. So I'm an adoptee and an adoptive mom, and my co-host on the podcast is a birth mom and an adoptive mom. So we like to bring that perspective to our show. Adoptees On is a podcast that is all stories of adoptees. On Instagram, I like to follow different accounts like Therapy Redeemed. He's a Korean adoptee. Katie the CAD, KAD, standing for Korean Adopted Adult Daughter. I'm not even sure. And she is also a Korean adoptee. Tori at Wreckage and Wonder is a Black transracial adoptee. So once you kind of get into the world of a couple, you can, a lot of them are following or collaborating with other adoptees. Another account that has, I think, a pretty balanced view of adoption is Unfolding Adoptees. And then there's also a YouTube channel called Yes, I'm Adopted, Don't Make It Weird. And that's kind of a fun one to follow as well.
Yeah, I do. I do love that YouTube channel as well. You touched on something there that I've touched on very briefly in your intro, which is your own journey. Do you mind to share a little bit more about that with the community, just so that they're aware of even why they should be tuning in to the Adoption Connection to really understand your journey as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, it starts all the way back with my own adoption story. I was a infant adoption through Holt and Catholic Charities and came home in the early 1980s. I have two siblings who are also adopted, neither one of them biologically related to me. And then, through lots of series of events, we have 4 of our 6 children came to us through adoption, all international adoptions. 1 was a toddler adoption from Korea, and then 3 were older children from Ethiopia. And so our oldest, and also out of birth order. So our oldest kids came to us. They were 11, 13, and 14 when they came home. And we went in completely blind to our first adoption. It woke us up to a lot of things. We discovered connected parenting and trust-based relational intervention, which I know we'll talk about here in a sec, and became trainers for parents just because we thought the information was so important. We had that under our belts when we adopted our older children and thought that that would prepare us. And there was still so much more that we had to learn. And, we learned a lot of it the hard way. And so it's through those experiences that led my business partner, Lisa, and I to create the Adoption Connection. She also has some hard in her story as an adoptive mom, and she had a lot of tools as well. And so we just are trying to kind of fill the gap and provide tools at the Adoption Connection for parents that are kind of what we wish we had 10 years ago when we were really struggling.
Yeah, honestly, I wish I'd found you guys earlier in my own journey as an adoptive mom. While I like to share the positive sides of adoption and kind of the opportunities to adopt, as you said, adoption is a journey, and some of it's hard. And even no matter where you are in the journey, there's always opportunity to learn and improve. That's probably my growth mindset coming out. I'm not sure what Enneagram number that makes me. I will definitely need to do that work. But I really believe that doing that research up front really does make a difference. So kudos to you for really unpacking and digging into that and really creating a community for us. That's super helpful. So I definitely do appreciate appreciate that. So I know one of the other areas that we definitely want to talk about is really how you can get help on your journey and seeing, the right appropriate support system, whether that be virtually or in person. So I'd love for you to give us a little bit more about that and how, as hopeful adoptive parents, we should be proactively seeking out those opportunities now to make us better equipped for the journey ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, being a parent, both by birth and through adoption, has, been my own personal awareness and personal growth journey, besides a bajillion other things. Right. Yeah. And so I really wish someone had sat me down, and I don't know if I really would have listened, quite honestly, but said, you're just going to need a good therapist to kind of process a lot of the things that are going to happen to you as a parent. And I wish I had sought that out proactively when I wasn't in crisis, when I had a little bit more time and creativity and to really do some work. I mean, we were super blessed that one of the first people we reached out to has been a godsend, and she's been our family therapist for over a decade now. But that is not the case with some families. And I have worked with families that have said, we're done. We've already fired 8 therapists and we're not going to go find another one. And some therapists have said things that are less helpful than helpful. And so I wish someone had helped me, understand that my strengths were also my weaknesses, and how those what cracks I had in my own personal journey, in my marriage, that, parenting, adoptive or not, kind of, exposes and magnifies. And so I think it's just good. I mean, I think all people, whether you're in the adoption journey or not, should have, a good therapist. And if you're religious, or and also if you're, spiritual at all, some kind of spiritual director. Yeah. And that's advice that I have taken to heart over the last couple of years. And it's literally life-changing, to have someone on the outside, and a parent coach. Like, I have a parent coach too, because we're so close to our own situations and we're emotionally involved. We all need outside people in our lives who we trust on all the different fronts to, help us process what's going on.
Mm-hmm. You are so right. It was a big growth moment for me personally when I finally felt like I was making the adult decision to, admit that I needed help in that journey. For me, it started when, I had that moment that I couldn't get off the couch, and I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I've never, what is this? I'm a type A driven individual. I've never had that moment before. And then it just became a habit and a routine. Right. And that made a difference. But what I did discover in my own personal journey is that even though I love my therapist dearly, she doesn't understand adoption. And there is a difference, in my opinion, based upon the reading and research that I've been doing, on having the right type of therapist for that particular situation. Is that something that you find in your work as well?
Yes, absolutely. So I think for our own journeys as parents, sometimes we can get away with a person who might not be fully adoption informed, because I feel like a lot of therapy is about reflecting on how what we're currently going through is impacting what has happened to us. And so I think there's a little bit of trauma informedness and attachment informedness that does need to come with that. I think a lot of what parents are looking for when they're up against tough behaviors, or they just need support, and where adoption competency is very important, is in the practical, what do I do next, or what's my next action step? And a lot of times a really good coach can do that with you as well. So sometimes your therapist can play both roles. Coaches aren't licensed, so they're not equipped to kind of, walk you through how this is bringing up, perhaps childhood wounds or things from your past. But I think they're both important parts. And so it's important to kind of figure out which one you're looking for. But yes, I think someone who speaks, adoption language and understands attachment and perhaps what it's like to parent a child who you don't have that innate biological connection with, and who understands, what it looks like for triangulation to occur, and how that's so common with kids who have attachment struggles. All of that really matters, and who understand how trauma intersects with adoption. I used to say that everyone needed a trauma-informed therapist. And I used to say trauma-informed trumps everything. And then I've really understood as trauma-informed has gotten bigger and broader, which is great because I think we all need more of that in our lives, that there's a difference between being trauma-informed and like adoption and competent and informed, because it is a small sliver of the trauma pie, if you will. And so it does require, I think, additional skills and experience and even vocabulary.
Yeah, I completely agree. When in my own journey, even I would just, ask questions. I was like, wait a minute, I think maybe there are other resources out there. And that was true even when I began learning what are different parenting styles too, right? That I began to realize like that those things were just not in my vocabulary, right? At the beginning, I was so focused on becoming a parent that I didn't really visualize or think through what I wanted to be like as a parent. I often coach my community to really think about, as they go into this, to really think about what life is like, once baby comes home. Then we think about the fun moments, right? We think about the happy moments of playing in the backyard with the kids or, coaching the little league and those types of things. But we don't often think about how do we best equip ourselves to grow a healthy human being as we go through this. So I'd love if you would talk a little bit about adoption parenting styles or parenting styles that really help adoptive parents the most.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple names for these things. Sometimes you'll hear it called trust-based parenting, connected parenting, brain-based parenting. I think the common thread through it all is that it understands how trauma and separation from a primary caregiver impacts the brain. Mm-hmm. And it understands that behavior is more than what meets the eye, right? That there's something bigger and deeper than just my child's being willfully disobedient or just acting like a jerk or trying to hurt me.
Right.
And that there are tools that we can use that support and help our children both feel safe and grow. Yeah. And I think all children should be parented with some of these things in mind. Obviously, they don't have the trauma piece, but at this point in the game, the world has lived through a global pandemic. And so even if we take the word trauma out and just insert chronic stress, mm-hmm. that changes the brain too. It changes who we are as parents and our brains. And then it changes how babies are coming into the world and processing the world. It's just really good relationship skills to learn. If you weren't parented this way, a new way to parent. And honestly, when my husband and I really figured it out and we started applying it to our friendships and work relationships and, our own parents, it just literally changed everything. And I would say for the better.
Yeah, I think that is amazing. And I like the spin that you're putting on it. They're just like the stress-based aspect of it, because yes, no matter your upbringing, whether or not you feel like you had trauma or not, there are other environmental factors that have shaped you even into your adult standing that have an impact on the relationships around you. And we all know that honestly, that the adoption journey can put a lot of stress on the relationships around you. So understanding how you react in those situations, I feel makes you a better parent, because then you can start to understand partners and, safety plans and people all around you to help to support you to really make sure that you're showing up the best you can to support this child, because that's ultimately your goal. And you mentioned the feeling like, that your child is a jerk or, those moments. I will fully admit that there are moments where I feel misaligned with my kids from time to time. And I have this struggle of, oh, did I do something wrong? Or did I, how did I impact them in this way? And so I think just researching those different parenting styles and having tools in your tool belt to readily go to really helps you feel more confident and calm as their parent, as their co-pilot in life, going through this adoption journey from that perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I just think I wish I had parented our kids from birth like this. And we have a granddaughter who lives with us. And so we're being able to apply some of this, more aware parenting style to her as we kind of help our daughter raise her. And I mean, it's magical, and I won't say that it makes parenting easy. In some ways we call it investment parenting. It takes a lot more energy to not just slap a punishment on a behavior and move on.
Right.
But I will say as parents who have tried it both ways, the long-term benefits and in terms of the strengthening of relationship between parents and children are huge. I think, the more what we call kind of traditional cause and effect parenting that kind of relies on more like behavior management type things are just, eventually, especially if a child who pushes a lot of boundaries really does ultimately harm the relationship. And sometimes we can recover from that and sometimes we can't. And so I think, just thinking about this relationship aspect, especially for kids who have lost such a tremendously important relationship in their lives, is just super, super important.
Yeah, I think one of the most important skills that I've learned through acquiring some new tools in my tool belt is the power of observation, right? And then pausing to reflect before I react. It's hard. And, it can be hard in the moment because you can feel all, tense and riled up. But I've really learned that if I can just take a deep breath, I'm a real big fan of Daniel Tiger in our house. We do a lot of Daniel Tiger's little chants and sayings. I don't own any copyrights. But we say them over and over again. But, it's funny. So I am a big person of just observation. I like to watch the world around me. I'm a people watcher at heart, so to speak, but I would watch friends and their different parenting styles. Right. And I have the benefit of being an older parent, right, at 42 with a 6 and 4-year-old. And so I have the benefit of seeing what they've kind of, friends have experienced in their lives and the strategies that they deploy to move forward. But that didn't really take the place of feeling it day in and day out and having those tools in my tool belt to really be able to react. And once I came across the whole idea of just pausing and taking a breath, something so simple made such a massive impact in that. But I think that leads to a really important topic that I know you talk about a lot, which is taking intentional rest so that you can recharge to be a better parent. I know that that's one of the topics you wanted to share with us today, but I think that is really important to even think about at this stage in the journey. Would you mind to share more about that with us?
Yeah, I think we all as parents need breaks. And I think adoptive parents probably need breaks more than parents of neurotypical kids, and they're less likely to take them. Yeah. So it's kind of this double-edged sword, especially if you have longed for years to be a parent. I know that my mom identifies with this, I remember her saying I waited so long to be a parent. I was not going to, leave you with anybody. I was not going to, pawn you off for someone else to take care of because I had just waited and waited and waited so long for this. But I will also say that we have to be the stable foundation for our families. And parenting is a long road. And unfortunately, I'm going to tell you that it does not end at 18, like we all think. So,
I imagine.
Yeah. And so, especially your audience who is often starting with infants, 18 years at a minimum is a long road to look at without really thinking about how you're going to energize and sustain yourself. And a lot of that energizing can't happen unless we take true breaks and respite. And so I encourage my clients to kind of work towards a small break a day, right? So it could be just like a rest time, downtime. It could be 15 minutes, it could be an hour, right?
Right.
Like a couple hours a week, and that could be trading off with your spouse to, get a cup of coffee or see a friend or something like that. if you can't do every week, at least every month, to really get away, like a date night a month, and then a full 24 hours to a full weekend, longer if you can get away with it, at least once a year.
Yeah.
That parents need that. Parents, both moms and dads, need that. And the other thing I think is important, a lot of our kids have separation anxiety because of their attachment challenges. And so I know a lot of parents will say, it's not worth it, or my kid's terrified when I leave and I can't do that to them. But the thing is one of the ways that we can help grow our children's window of tolerance for these things is in small chunks.
That's right.
And so it might be that you leave them at a person who that they are safe with and who maybe they've had interactions with. It could be a grandparent, for instance. And they might still scream when you leave, and you might only leave for a cup of Starbucks, 15 minutes away for, 15 minutes, and you might come back in 30 minutes. But just that, my parent can leave and then come back. Practice over and over and over again is what builds your ability to work towards longer periods of respite. And I know that sometimes we talk about reentry, and that can feel really, really hard. And sometimes that makes it feel like it's not even worth it. And I would say the same thing. We have to build up our kids' window of tolerance, and get breaks. And the thing that really drove this home for me is, I have 6 kids and 3 girls who potentially will all be moms one day. And what my mother taught me by accident was that it wasn't okay to take breaks, because she was with us all the time. I mean, I remember maybe like an anniversary date night here or there. And then of course, when we were older, she got a little bit better at it. But when we were little, she was always there. And of course, that's a great memory to have. And it's not bad parenting, right? but it did instill with me when I was a young mom. I thought, moms don't take breaks, because my mom never took a break. And because I categorized my mom as such a great mom, I thought that the way that she did things was the right way to do things. And so I think a lot about that when I think about the balance that I want my girls, or even my sons, to be able to have as when they are parents, that I want them to not lose their identity in their parenthood. And I think the only way that we can do that is to model it in healthy ways for our kids.
Yeah, I think modeling the behavior is something that we don't often think about, but what we do day in and day out does really have an impact. And you're right, not taking a break can send the wrong message. I know for us in our household, it's, occasionally even my 6-year-old can be like, Mom, you need a break. You need to walk away. Like, it was so sweet this morning. She was like, I'll make my sandwich for school today. Like, I think you should go sit down and eat your breakfast rather than standing at the bar to eat your breakfast. But, it's just moments like that you don't realize what behavior you're modeling. And I'm like, yes, I actually should model the fact that you are worthy of sitting down at a table to eat your meal rather than, standing at the bar. And you're right also that it does feel like a foreign concept when you're in this waiting stage of bringing baby home, that you would want to take a break from baby, or that you would need to take a break for baby. I know that was something that I personally struggled, baggage of disruption aside, but that I personally struggled with. Is like, I didn't want to give up those moments with them, right? I was like, no, I want to see every little bit of everything. And even being a working parent, that was so hard as being a working adoptive parent, because I had kind of the double guilt of, yes, it was always the plan that I would continue working. And that was very clear to our expectant parents. But then once they came home, I didn't want to miss a minute of it. And then, for myself, for her, and then for the birth families as well, like I wanted this full experience. And so it took a while for me to realize, to your point, that it's okay, and that they learn that they are safe in other places, and they can grow and learn from other sources and not just from me. And that behavior that you're modeling really does have an impact, and it shows up a lot faster than you think, even at 6. So
yeah, awesome. Absolutely.
I know that really having resources for your children as they grow and expand and really want to understand kind of the world around them, but also their world is really important. Can you touch upon that for our audience so that they know what to really be prepared for, not only for themselves into making themselves like the most connected and well-informed parent that they can, but also what resources they should plan ahead for their child as they grow and learn in their own journey?
Yeah, this is one of those ones that's going to be hard to hear.
Mhm.
I think that families should save an additional $10,000 per child. And that is a little bit of an arbitrary number, but it's a ballpark for future post-adoption services.
Yeah.
And here's why. I think, we were just talking about how important adoption competency is in
Mhm.
our providers. And that's not just for like therapists and counselors, like our mental health team. It's also for the speech language folks that we might need for our children and the occupational therapist. I think I've yet to meet a adoptive family who's adopted in the last 10 years who hasn't used either speech or OT for their child.
Yeah.
And again, it just has to do with the way that children's brains are rewired, when they lose that primary caregiver. And it matters that they're trauma and adoption informed, because otherwise they may ask you to do things or push your child in a way that doesn't honor what their history is. There's also, I think every adopted person at some point in their journey should access some kind of body work. We know from Bessel van der Kolk's work and The Body Keeps the Score that the body does keep the score, and that trauma sits in our bodies. And when we're talking about infant adoptions, it's all pre-verbal trauma. And, you mentioned a little bit earlier, Amanda, how there's this misconception that if we adopt at infancy or bring our children home from the hospital or are there in the delivery room, that we're minimizing the impact of trauma. And there's, on our podcast, we had a nurse come and talk about this. She's an adoptive mom, and talk about just how much bonding happens in utero and how much of a bond is broken when a baby comes out of the world expecting to hear and taste and experience certain things. And the person who snuggles up to them smells, tastes, and sounds different. And it's a thing, right? And so in some ways, because there's not a cultural awareness and understanding of this, it's growing, but it was 100%, absent when I was born. And that there's no verbalization. A lot of the way that we process trauma is to create a coherent story around it. And if we can remember the traumatic things, we can recall them and we can talk them out and we can reprocess them. And we don't have that opportunity if we have experienced a pre-verbal trauma. And so I think bodywork therapy in my story has been 100% the key to my own personal growth. It's been the key for so many families that we work with, and insurance doesn't cover very much of it. So, bodywork things are like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprogramming, trauma release exercise, the safe and sound protocol, brain spotting. All of these things are such great tools for families, and they can be costly, and insurance doesn't cover them. And when we were in crisis with one of our children, I knew a lot of the things that I wanted to do to serve her, and we were up against a financial barrier, and it just greatly limited what we could offer for her. It exponentially increased the amount of stress we felt in that situation. I mean, we already know, right? Like, money is one of the number one stresses in marriage. And so I just hate when I hear that families are struggling to get help. And one of the reasons that they're, being choosy about the help or not going outside of their insurance to find a truly adoption informed resource is because of finances. And what happens is because we're trying to, work within our financial means, then sometimes we make decisions that end up costing us more down the road. There's nothing worse, again, like going with a mental health person who's inside your insurance network. And there might be some fantastic ones. And also my experience has been that the ones that have all the extra training in adoption have such long wait lists that they don't have to take insurance. So
Right.
that we need a little bit of wiggle room financially to think about how to meet the needs of our kids. And it could be, it just could be so many things from, having the money to buy extra fidgets and weighted blankets to even hiring an education advocate, because a lot of our kids need IEPs and 504s. And so there's just lots of things. And I think I haven't met one adoptive family who hasn't had to pay out of pocket a significant amount for the services that they need. And we just don't think about it. We think about all the money we need for the adoption, and we did it, right? We did all the adoption fundraisers for our adoptions and all of that. But I think it would be wise to think a little bit further down the road as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we often think when we're, saving for our adoption expenses, we often think that finalization is the end of it, right?
Yeah.
But really thinking past finalization, I guess, is the entire message of today's episode. Really is being intentional about what care that you are able to provide, and then how you are as a parent, and intentionally setting yourself up during this waiting period to really think about that, get in alignment with your spouse if there is one in the picture, and then really planning ahead. To me, is the best work that I wish I had done in my own journey to really make me informed. And quite honestly, I think that would have helped me feel a lot more calm about my waiting period as well, if I had known that I was setting myself up to best really serve my children as they came into my home. Well, thank you, Melissa. You have been just such a wealth of knowledge, and I am so excited again that you were able to join us. I would love for my community to be able to dive in and to learn more from you and from Lisa. Where can they check you out, and where can they follow you?
Yeah. Well, if you're listening to this as a podcast, then just pop into your podcast app and look up the Adoption Connection. Almost all of our episodes are what we call like evergreen. So they're, not super they don't have to be listened to like right when they come out. So, even though the podcast has been around for 4 years, you probably will find things all the way back at episode 1 that will still apply to you.
I do. I do.
Well, good. I'm glad. I'm so glad. And then if you are a Facebook person and you like to dive into, what Facebook groups have to offer, we do have a free Facebook group. And you can find that at theadoptionconnection.com/Facebook.
Great. And I would also highly suggest the community really checks out your community and your support village, because I do think there are some great resources that even beyond the podcast and the free Facebook group that folks should really check out in your community. And we'll make sure to link to all of that in the show notes as well. And then you guys, Melissa is highly accessible. If you just want to reach out to her and ask a question, she can point you to the right resource inside of her community that could really help you the most if you have one particular area that you're really struggling with. I know she's been incredibly valuable for us as a family. So thank you again, Melissa, so much for joining us. I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share your wealth of wisdom with our community.
Well, Amanda, thanks so much. And thanks for being willing to bring such important topics to your audience as well.
Oh, thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
I hope that you found today's conversation incredibly valuable. I know that myself as an adoptive parent, I find a lot of value in the work that Melissa and Lisa are doing over at the Adoption Connection. I certainly do hope that you take the time to check them out. Of course, all the links will be available where you're watching or listening to this episode. And if you think this episode could be helpful for someone in one of the Facebook groups that you're seeing, I sure would love it if you would share it with them, and even considering hitting that subscribe button and liking this video.